Alright, in this video we're going to cover two basic things. I'm going to talk about what you need to start running your first Python scripts. That's where you actually, instead of running through the interpreter directly like we did in the last video, you'll actually write code to a file, and you'll send the file to the interpreter, and it'll go through and try to run your code that way. I'm going to discuss what you need for that, and then I'm also going to talk about input and output and show you some examples with that, as well as how to actually run your code once you put it into a file. Alright, all you should need, assuming you watched the last video or you've already looked up and figured out how to download and install Python, where you have the interpreter, assuming you've already done that, then the only other thing you need is a plain text editor. In my case, I'm using Notepad++. I think that's Windows only, I believe. I don't know. I don't use it a whole lot. But anyway, you can actually use something as simple as Notepad on Windows. Um, you just want to avoid things that you want to avoid things like LibreOffice Writer, Microsoft Word, WordPad, things like that that actually have formatting built in. Because the formatting, when you do the formatting, basically it puts characters and symbols behind the scenes that you won't see, but when you go to run your code, the interpreter will see it and go, I don't know what this means, and crash. Your code won't work. So you can Google search plain text editors. There's tons that are kind of oriented towards programming, and you just get you one of those, and then you're good to go. There's some really fancy ones out there that are more along the lines of like IDEs, like Eclipse and things like that. That will actually do a bunch of fancy stuff for you, like auto code completion and a bunch of other crazy stuff, which is fantastic. And I suggest using those tools eventually. But in the beginning, I would get something very basic, like what I'm using here, that just has like syntax highlighting and basic things like that. That way, you're forced to do all the programming yourself, which means that you'll learn it better. And once you get comfortable with the language, then you can start adding in start using the fancier features. Okay, so I'm gonna have to jump around slightly. I would like to just go ahead and run code immediately so you can see how that works before I talk about input and output. But with the way that Python deals with scripts, that wouldn't actually work. And when we were dealing with the interpreter directly in the last video, we could just type in some line of code, like a math operation or a variable name or something, and it would echo it back, the answer back to the screen. Well, it doesn't do that when you're writing code and then running it through the file from a file. So we'll actually have to print our results. So let's kind of jump ahead real quick and we'll talk about that, and then I'll wrap back around and show you how to run the code. There's actually a keyword called print in Python, and what print does is it prints it prints whatever you ask it to the console here. Uh, then that's going to be the output part of the input output we discuss. Um, with print, you can just say print, and then you can give it some value, a literal value or a variable. You can actually give it math operations, all kinds of stuff. It's pretty smart. But just as a first example, we can print hello world. It's kind of a traditional first thing with a lot of programming languages. This the hello world program, this little one-liner, and then save it. Actually, let me show you. Let's do save as. Let's show you what I did. I saved it. I just chose to save it to the desktop. I named it input output .py. That's the extension for Python. And then in my case, I chose this extension. If you're using something simpler like just plain old Notepad, then you would just say save as and put the extension, and it would be fine. And yeah, I know it exists. Yes. Okay. So now we've got that. This is our first actual script we've written. Now I can go to the terminal here. And well, first of all, when you run Python, with Python, when you run, um, at least the way I'm doing it right now, just for now, we'll just do this. You need to be in the same when you're going to run a file, you need to be in the same directory with the command prompt as that file. So you could say cd, which means change directory, and type wherever you want to go. In my case, the desktop, or in your case, if you say it somewhere else, the path to where you go to make sure I'm there. And then like before, I type Python, but instead of just stopping there and hitting enter and opening the interpreter, I say Python space the name of the file, which in my case is input output.py, and hit enter. When I hit enter, Python will go look for that file, take the code from the file, and run it. And you'll see here it says hello world because I told it to print that to the screen. So With the print statement in this form, there's actually multiple ways to do the print statement here, but with the print statement in this form, it's actually kind of smart. Like when you actually do printing to the console, everything has to be a string. Like you can't print a number directly to the screen. You actually have to turn it into the string equivalent first. But like this, Python will actually convert it for you. So we could say Python comma 4. There's an integer 4.4 5.46. There's a float. Now this with this print statement here, how basically you can think of it boiling down in this form is it says print. Python sees print and says, okay, you want me to print whatever this the right of this to the screen. So I need to print hello world, the string. Then this comma means add a space. So I need to print hello world. Because of this comma, I know I need to add a space. Then print the number 4, add another space, print 5.46, and then that's all I've got left to print. So I'll go ahead and go to the next line once I'm done printing all this stuff. So we save it again, go back to the terminal, run it again. You'll see it says hello world 4 and then 5.46. Now, I didn't even think about this until just now, but there's also a comma here. So you may wonder, okay, well, why is it not, added, interpreting that comma into another space? Well, that's because that comma is inside of the string. Just so there's no confusion there. It's part of that string. See, it's in between the quotes there. So that's why it's not interpreting it to an extra space like it did with these two. That's the basics of print. For the most part, you should be able to throw, most of your basic, at least for now, most of the basic types you can throw to it like that, and it will go ahead and print it out for you. There's and that's there's like two other ways you can do it. For those that have done other programming like C and C++, I'll tell you there's a printf version of the print statement you can use. And there's also one where you go back to using the string concatenation thing that we're using in the first video. But those, those will just kind of pretend like they don't exist right now to keep it simple. You can also use the print statement just by itself. And what happens if you use a print statement by itself is it'll, like I said, the basic idea of the print statement is print everything to the right of it and then go to the next line. So if there's nothing to print, there's nothing you gave it to print, it'll just add new lines. So as you'll see, if I run it this time, it won't show anything because I didn't tell it to actually print any words or numbers, but it'll add a bunch of blank spaces, which will be 4 because of the 4 print statements. So that's the basic of print. Next, we'll go into actually getting input and output from the screen. But actually, you know what? Before we do that, too, I'll show you something else while I'm thinking about it. Because I was saying you can do a lot of other things. You can do math operations and things like that in the print statement. I'll show you that real quick. So we'll say the result of, I don't know, 5 times 4, oops, is, and say comma, and then I can say 5 times 4. And you'll see here that it'll actually do this math and get an answer first before it prints. And so it'll actually print the results out. Just to kind of show you that you can do multiple things inside of a print statement. You see the result of 5 times 4 is 20, which is right. 5 times 4 is 20. Once again, the reason why that it's not doing the multiplication here is because this is inside of the string. So it sees this is a string character and that is a multiplication operator because this is inside of a string. Alright, now we're talking about input. I saved that for last because it's slightly more complicated. Remember earlier when I was talking about the fact that everything that goes to the console when you print has to be in string format. You can't actually print a number. You have to print the string equivalent of it, or with the string version that looks like that number. Well, following that same principle, if you're getting input from the user, since everything in the console is of string format, that means that everything you get from them will be string format, which can make it a little bit hairier if you ask the user for some piece of data and it's supposed to be a number, then you'll have to convert it yourself. But it's not that hard. We'll show you how to do it. There's a thing called raw input. Raw underscore input is the actual syntax, and then open parentheses, close parentheses. This is the most basic form of getting the input from the user. We'll just run that by itself, and you'll see that you don't see it just goes to you hit enter and it just sits there and blinks like nothing's happening. Well, it's actually waiting for you to enter something. You enter whatever, and then the program dies because that's all the code you had. So the basic format of raw input is you're going to have raw input, open parentheses, close parentheses. Inside this parentheses, you can put a string or a variable containing a string. So I could say, enter a number, and then whatever's inside of here, whatever string's inside of here, it'll print that out to the user for the user to see first. So it'll enter a number out to the screen, and then it'll sit there and wait for the user to enter something, like so. It says enter a number, and then it'll just sit there and flash, and it'll wait literally forever if it could. If you don't enter anything, and this computer could run this program for the rest of the eternity, it would just sit there waiting to enter something. You enter something, and then it's done. You could also, like I said, you could also put a variable in here that you could also put a variable in there that contains a string. So I could say we'll make a variable called prompt, and we'll store the data, the string. Whoops. We'll store the string, enter a number in there, like so. And then I can just pass the variable prompt, which just contains this phrase, and you get the same effect. As you can see, it just goes back to, it says enter a number, you enter something, exits. Okay, so what you can think of is raw inputs. When Python sees this, and say, okay, raw input. You look inside of here. If there's anything in here, I'll display it to the screen, and now I'll just sit here until they enter something. And when they enter something, then I'll just take whatever they entered and stick it on the same line. So you can almost think of, like when I entered 5, you can almost think of it as Python sits here and waits, and then when I enter 5, it erases the line that says raw input and just types a 5 there. You can kind of think of it like that. It makes it a little bit easier. So with that being said, that means that once that raw input is in, you had that value returned, unless you do something with it immediately or you save it into a variable, unless you do one of those two things, it's lost forever. Because as soon as it goes to the next line, we went to line 5, it's going to have forgotten about that value that was entered. So commonly what you're going to do, unless you're just going to take whatever's entered and do something with it immediately, is you'd save it into a variable, and we'll just call it input, just so that's the input that the user gave us. So you say input equals raw input and all that good stuff that we just talked about. And I can turn around and say print input. Now what's going to happen is whatever the user enters is going to it's going to sit here and just wait until the user enters something, and it's going to copy and paste basically whatever they entered. You can think of it as copy and pasting it over this line, and then it'll save it into input. Because remember, the assignment operator with variables just says take whatever's on the right side and shove it on the left side. And then we can turn around and print it out to show that it worked, and you can see that it saved it. So we'll enter 60, and then bam, it prints out a 60 right there, just like we'd expected. So no major issues there. Okay, but what you will see though that might throw you off a little bit, the type is, because even though it prints out the number 60 and there's not quotes around it, you'll see that it still thinks that this number is a string, even though they typed in 60 or 5 or 400 or whatever. So what I'm doing here is a function, which we'll discuss functions in a later video, called type. And you say type, open parentheses, whatever you want to know the type of, close parentheses. And then what it'll do is it'll return something saying the equivalent of this is a string or this is a float or integer or what have you. So when we run that, and we're printing that to the screen. So when we run that, enter 50, you'll see the type is type str, which means string. So even though it's printed out as looking like a number without quotes, it still sees this as a string, which could cause problems. Because you tell them to enter a number, say like you're wanting to enter a number so you can do some kind of math calculation with it. Well, if it's not an actual number, you're not going to be able to deal with it mathematically like you would expect. So that's where type conversions come in. There's 3 basic ones that we're going to, that just kind of you can associate with the types I've talked about. There's str, float, and int. Okay, so basically you have string, which is str, float, which is completely spelled out, and int, which is just short for integer. And all 3 of those, you have the name of the type, open parentheses, close parentheses. Inside this parenthesis, Instead of parentheses, you can stick a literal value or a variable that contains whatever you want to convert, and then it'll try to convert it to that type. So if I stuck something in here, it would try to convert it to a string. If I stuck this thing inside of there, it would try to convert it to a float. Stuck it in here, it would try to convert it to an int. In our case, in our case, we just said enter a number. We didn't specify a whole number or refer to a floating point number or what. So we'll just kind of catch all cases. We'll assume that they may enter a decimal number. So what we can do is we can say float input because that's what contains that string that the whatever they entered. And then what that will do is it'll take the data inside of here, a copy of the data inside of here, and it will convert it to a floating point. The keyword there is copy. It doesn't take what it pulls that data out and converts it, but it doesn't stick it back there in there for you. You have to do that manually. So you actually say input equals float input. So what would happen is it would say, okay, you want to convert something to a float. You want to convert this thing to a float. We'll go inside of here, and then we'll get a copy of that, paste, stick it in there, convert it to a float, and then this line basically gets overwritten by whatever the new number is, and then we'll save it into here. Okay, so now when we converted it, we'll be able to say print. I'm gonna say print input times like 10. I guess that'll work, and you'll see that we'll actually get a number back like we'd expect. So we'll say 5, and then 5.0 times 10 is equal to 50, which is what you'd expect. That's why conversion is important. If you didn't convert it, it would still be in string format. And we'll use what's called a comment here. The pound symbol is the comment symbol. So notice how everything turned yellow here. Basically, what that means is it comments out the code, which means the interpreter will ignore it. So in my case, I commented out this line of code, so the interpreter will just ignore this line of code and not try to run it. You can also use comments if I wanted to enter a comment and say, I'm doing blah blah blah, to explain what I'm doing in part of the code. You could also use it for that. But anyway, alternatively, I could just erase the code, but I just kind of show the comment. This will keep this part from running. So it'll get the user's input, but it'll never actually convert it to a float. And when you do that, you'll see enter 5 again. It just repeats the number 5, 10 times because, like was showing in the first video, it will when you do a string, multiply a string by a number, it just makes that many copies of that string and then pastes them together. So that's your basic little thing on conversion and input and output. You'll get more. So you need to play around with this. You'll get more experience and kind of get more used to it, and you'll see more examples in the future. I kind of went ahead and some people, a lot of times you'll see people that will wait a little bit longer on input and output, but I want to get it out there early. That way we can start writing scripts earlier instead of playing with the interpreter. So you'll start seeing a lot more examples of me doing input and output when I start talking about other things in future videos.